Okay, so it's with my great honor and pleasure to be able to tell you the story about John McCrae today, and of course we're here at his grave site. So it's like a whole circle that we're doing, where we started off in Guelph and we're ending it here in France, just like McCrae did. So our little presentation this morning is divided into sections of John McCrae's life with the appropriate music to support it. And I'm hoping that I can give you some new tidbits about John McCrae in the little talk here. So, of course, John McCrae was born in Guelph, Ontario. He's the second son of David and Janet McCrae, and they were married January 21st, 1870 in the limestone cottage at 108 Water Street, which of course is McCrae House today, and it's the museum. John was born on November 30th, St. Andrew's Day, and David and Janet already had an older son named Thomas. Now, in 1874, the family moved to a larger home on Woolwich Street, and it was in 1878 the family was completed with a baby girl named Gilles, who was born. McCrae attended the Central Public School, and by age 12, he was off to high school at Guelph Collegiate Institute. Now, John has a bunch of scrapbooks, and we have them. They have them at the McCrae House archives. And if you go through these scrapbooks and look, you can see that he was great at reading adventure stories from the boys' own paper. And he sketched, and he created the scrapbook pages with illustrations from the magazines. And you could see there was a real interest in trains and ships and traveling. And so what came to fruition for him was, in age 14, he accompanied his father over on a trip to England and Scotland. It was a business trip for David, and McCrae wrote back all the sights that he saw, and so thrilled to be doing this travel. John's father, David, was very involved too. He liked outdoor life, and he was a lacrosse player and, of course, a member of the Guelph Curling Club. And David helped his father, Thomas, run the family lumber and woolen mill business, and then eventually became a renowned stock breeder of Galloway cattle. Now, Janet Eckford, who's John's mother, she was a daughter of a Presbyterian minister. She was an avid reader and was taught Latin and Greek by her father. She was a good singer, loved literature, music, and poetry, and these are all traits that John would inherit. Church and faith played an important role in John McCrae's life. Apparently, by the age of 3, and before he could read, he could recite the shorter catechism of the Church of Scotland. The McCrae family was very dedicated to St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Guelph, and the McCrae pew is still there today. Now, while he was at university, John attended both the St. James Square Presbyterian and the Bloor Street Presbyterian churches. He would attend one service in the morning and quite often attend another service in the evening, writing home about what the minister spoke about and whether he agreed or disagreed with the content of the sermon, or whether the minister was a good speaker or not. Now, even here in France, McCrae attended the weekly church services at number 3, where visiting army chaplains of many different faiths would conduct the services.
O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal hope. 1,000 ages in your sight are like an evening gone, short as the watch that ends the night before the rising sun.
Now, at age 16, John headed to Toronto to attend University College at the University of Toronto, and big brother Tom was already there studying to be a doctor. McCrae was a well-rounded student. He played rugby, took fencing lessons, sang in the glee club, helped behind the scenes with the drama club, and this is when he began to write his poetry and short stories for the school newspaper, The Varsity, and other Canadian magazines as well. McCrae graduated in 1894 with his Bachelor of Arts from the Department of Biology with an honors and earned a gold medal for academic achievement in physiology and pathology. He then entered medical school at UT and was very successful in securing a 3-year fellowship in biology. And this fellowship helped pay the bills and laid the foundation for his future teaching and his research careers. It was in his 3rd year of studies, he was a resident physician at the Robert Garrett Hospital in Mount Airy, Baltimore. And this was a convalescent home for sick children. He spent 2 summers at this hospital. He graduated in 1898 with a gold medal for first-class standing, and then he started his career. He was appointed house officer at Toronto General Hospital and at the Burns Lying-In Hospital, which is a polite way of saying a maternity hospital. He then served as a resident house officer at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, and this is where he worked with his brother Thomas and the famous Dr. William Osler. And McCrae maintained this friendship for the rest of his life. In September of 1899, McCrae arrived in Montreal on one of 2 governor fellowships offered at McGill University, and this was the opportunity to study under Dr. George Dammy, McGill's professor of pathology. John McCrae became one of the first Canadians to receive a formal training in laboratory research. After he completed his fellowship, he was offered the position of professor of pathology at McGill University and taught a number of classes to medical students and still continued his research. McCrae's working life was also divided between 3 hospitals, where he was the pathologist at the Royal Victoria Hospital, the Montreal General Hospital, and at the Montreal Foundling and Baby Hospital. And he also had a small private practice. For 8 years, he was a special professor of pathology and lectured at the University of Vermont Medical College, and he commuted there 1 day a week from Montreal by train to Burlington, Vermont. In 1910, he received his MD from the University of Toronto of Medicine for his thesis on a study of 850 cases of scarlet fever with more particular consideration of 71 fatal cases. In 1911, McCrae's research work was cited in a number of chapters of Professor Adami's book, Principles of Pathology. And then in 1912, Adami and McCrae co-authored what became the go-to pathology textbook called Pathology for Students of Medicine in 1912, and he co-wrote a second edition that was released in 1914. As a result of the research and the formal training he received in laboratory research, McCrae was one of the best trained physicians of his generation, and his research advanced our understanding of tuberculosis, scarlet fever, nephritis, and lobar pneumonia. McCrae authored more than 30 papers with research that included almost 1,000 autopsies. Because of this research, McCrae was inducted into the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame in April of 2015 in a ceremony in Winnipeg.
No.
John McCrae's father was very active in the militia, having served in the Fenian raids and was commander of the No. 2 Battery, 1st Brigade in Guelph. And it was while attending high school, McCrae was active as a Highland cadet, and in 1887, his dedication earned him a gold medal as the best drilled cadet in Ontario. At the age of 15, he was a bugler in his father's artillery, and in 1891 he enrolled as a gunner and was promoted to lieutenant in 1896. His chance came to serve overseas and put all this training to good work happened in 1899 when demands for a second contingent were required to fight in the South African War. McCrae received permission to postpone his fellowship at McGill, and then Lieutenant John McCrae was assigned to command the right section of D Battery of the Royal Canadian Field Artillery. The Guelph Mercury newspaper wrote, McCrae, both for his proficiency as a soldier and knowledge and skill in medicine, should make him a model officer for service in South Africa. The men spent 2 weeks in Guelph being drilled and trained in rifle shooting and horsemanship, and in January 1900, when the day of departure arrived, the mayor of Guelph proclaimed a half-day holiday, and the local people turned out to give their men a huge send-off. John paraded the men and then set out for the railway station to head to Ottawa en route to Halifax to board the troop ship, the Laurentian. Although he saw some action and participated in 3 battles, most of John's time was spent guarding strategic points along the railway line or moving columns of artillery across an unfamiliar and very hostile landscape. He returned to Montreal in 1901 and resumed his fellowship at McGill. Now, when the First World War began in 1914, McCrae was 41 years old. He was a doctor with a very distinguished career. He was at the forefront of his profession through his expertise in teaching, publications, and reputation. But his sense of duty, his strong instinct against injustice, and his inequality were truths which demanded that a personal effort be made, and John made that effort and volunteered to serve. He was offered the position of medical officer in the 1st Brigade Canadian Field Artillery, commanded by his old friend from the South African War days, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Morrison. Now, John made his way to Camp Valcartier outside of Quebec City, where the 1st Brigade mobilized, trained, did drill and target practice, and they left for England on October the 2nd, 1914. After 16 days at sea, the Canadians headed for more training at Salisbury Plain, where they were stationed until February of 19 when they traveled to France. At the end of March, the Canadian Division marched across Flanders countryside to take up new position west of the town of Ypres. It was here that McCrae's unit endured the Second Battle of Ypres and encountered chlorine gas for the first time. For over 2 weeks, John lived in a small dugout in an embankment tending the wounded, and John McCrae penned the poem In Flanders Fields during this time. Now, McCrae's poem was written after the deaths of Alexis Helmer and Owen Haig on May 2nd, 1915. Both Helmer and Haig were members of the 1st Brigade and very popular men in the unit. Helmer was killed by a shell and Haig was severely injured, dying later that night. McCrae said the funeral service for Helmer, repeating as much as he could from memory, as the Padre was further down the line doing exactly the same thing. The poem first appeared in Punch magazine on December 8, 1915. It was filler, tucked away unobtrusively into a lower corner of the back page of the magazine. Now, many poets penned answers to In Flanders Fields, and governments throughout the English-speaking world quickly seized on the popularity of In Flanders Fields and used lines and imagery from the poem to encourage support for the war effort. McCrae wrote to his mother, I am amazed at the cropping up of the verses. It is pleasant to hear of such notoriety. Did you tell me it had been set to music? In 1917, Vancouver church organist J. Dean Wells published a melodic version of the poem, one of the first of numerous musical settings created for the poem.
In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the lark still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amidst the guns below. We are the dead, short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunsets glow, loved and were loved, now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up your quarrel against the foe. To you from flicking hands we hold the torch. Yours to hold it high, if ye break faith with us who die. We shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.
At the end of May 1915, McCrae received his orders to report to the No. 3 Canadian General Hospital McGill in London, England. It was time for him to join his medical colleagues as the officer in charge of medicine of this unit. The unit arrived in France and was ready for patients in August of 1915. This hospital was the brainstorm of Dr. Herbert Burkett, Dean of Faculty of Medicine at McGill, who put forward the idea that the hospital be staffed by doctors and medical students from the university. Though disappointed he could not stay at the front, McCrae left for his new post, promoted as Lieutenant Colonel. Now McCrae continued to work at the hospital for the next 3 years until he became quite ill on January 25th. He died of pneumonia and meningitis on January 28, 1918. And it was just a few days before his death that McCrae had received word that he was appointed consultant physician to the British armies in the field, the first Canadian to receive such an appointment, and reflected the very high regard in which he was held. He was buried here with full military honors the next day in the cemetery. One of the nurses described the funeral as follows: "I have never seen such a gathering of military notabilities before in France. It was a great and well-deserved tribute to the honor and esteem in which Colonel McCrae was held." Now McCrae's rank entitled him to a horse, and Bonfire was the gift of Dr. John Todd of Montreal, who gave McCrae the Irish Hunter. Bonfire was his companion throughout the war, and the two of them would go for long rides through the countryside. Bonfire followed the coffin at the funeral, and a nursing sister writes, "Immediately after the coffin came his horse Bonfire, his bridle all laced in white ribbon, and the long boots reversed in the stirrups. Poor Bonfire, he was a pathetic sight, and seeing him riderless brought home to us more forcibly than anything else could that Colonel McCrae had left us."
Going home, I'm just going home. Quiet like slip away, I'll be going home. It's not far, just close by, through an open door. Work all done, cares laid by, fear and grief no more. Morning star lights the way, restless dreams are done. Shadows gone, break of day, life is just begun. Going home, I'll be going home. See the light, see the sun, I'll be going home. I'll be going home.
war, the poppy officially became the symbol of remembrance. Charities around the world began to sell poppies at Armistice Day to raise money for lives and landscapes laid waste to war. Two of the pioneers of the poppy movement, Moïna Michael in the US and Anne Guerin in France, named In Flanders Fields as their direct inspiration. Canada had her own poppy lady by the name of Lillian Freeman, who adopted the fundraiser idea and made poppies in her living room in Ottawa. By 1922, Poppy Day had become an established custom, with poppies being sold, worn, and placed on graves in many countries. While the red poppy had a long history as a symbol of sacrifice and rebirth, John McCrae's poem In Flanders Fields gave it new meaning, a remembrance of those who died in the war. McCrae's legacy lives on as poppies and lines from the poem appear on war memorials across Canada and all over the world. John McCrae's birthplace is preserved thanks to keen foresight of three families who remortgaged their homes in order to purchase the house. It opened in 1968 and was run by a volunteer organization, the McCrae Birthplace Society, until the mid-1980s, when the society transferred ownership to the city of Guelph. The house has been designated from the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada as a place of national significance in 1966, and John McCrae himself was designated as a person of national significance in 1946. The plaque is mounted on the outside of the house when it was still a private residence. There's a stained glass memorial window at the University of Toronto in the Soldiers Tower building and at McGill University in Montreal. The temporary exhibit gallery at the Canadian War Museum is named in his honor. Eileen Donan Castle on the Isle of Skye in Scotland has included John McCrae on the honor roll. There have been 2 stamps issued, a paper $10 bill, a $20 plastic bill, along with the quarters and toonies that have all been issued with poppies on them in his memory. In 1972, an Ontario Heritage Trust plaque was installed here at the cemetery, and in 1914 a plaque was installed at McCrae House. In 2015, a statue of McCrae was sculpted by Ruth Abernathy and was installed in Ottawa, and a duplicate is located on the grounds of the Guelph Civic Museum, where it overlooks the city of Guelph. Now, in conclusion, I would like to quote Maud Abbott, whom I feel is a kindred spirit. She was a colleague of McCrae's and was the curator of the McGill Medical Museum, where some of McCrae's pathology samples are still in the collection. She wrote these words when she heard of McCrae's death, and I think it will sum up all the feelings of all who knew John McCrae long ago, and those of us today who have heard his story and are touched by the poem he wrote more than 107 years ago, and I quote Maud, "Our hero of heroes, our man of men."
Prince can make a belted knight, a marquis, duke, and all that. An honest man to whom his might, each faith be man of faith that. For all that and all that, their dignities and all that, the fifth no sense and pride and worth are higher rank than all that. Let us pray that come it may, as come it will, for all that, with sense and worth, for all the earth shall bear the grief for all that. For all that and all that, it's coming yet for all that. But man to man, the world o'er, shall breathers be for all that. Shall breathers be for all that.
The end. I have to say that was really hard, right? When you're on stage and someone else is performing, you're supposed to put your focus on them, right? And my focus was on that grave site, and I could start to feel like, oh, I can't cry, can't cry, can't cry.
You can cry now.
I can cry now. It's so emotional, right? To study this man, and then there he is.